Evening, folks, and welcome back to the View podcast for a bit of a transfer special, I suppose, or at least an update into what we hope becomes a slightly more interesting transfer window for Leeds United. Rumours of a couple of bits and pieces floating around, but very much the company line of a quiet window so far. For Leeds, delighted to be joined by Ben Jacobs of Give Me Sport and Talk Sport as well to have a chat about what he's heard out there. But we'll check in with Ben first things first. Ben, how are you? How's things?
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me on. Looking forward to talking about Leeds. Pretty positive first half of the season. So let's hope they can get over the line and back up to the Premier League.
Yeah, I think everyone's looking at this window, Ben, with one eye on the Premier League and the other eye on making a mess of this if we don't get the window right, looking at what the opponents are doing. But I wanted to start off, Ben, because I know you're under pressure for time tonight. So I wanted to jump straight into it. But I want to start off with kind of a generic transfer question because there's a ripple effect to this. The PSR situation in the Premier League appears to be, at least on paper, okay at the moment. Nobody was charged with any breaches of financial fair play. Given that last year in January, we saw 700 million come out of the January transfer market compared to the previous years, do you think that the situation on PSR in the Premier League right now means that there might be slightly more spending? And the reason I asked that question is for the ripple effect and the drip effect that will come into other players becoming available then to move maybe the championship clubs.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So no clubs charged with PSR. I think teams are learning to navigate PSR a little bit. And in addition to that, you might find heading into the summer that PSR is replaced, if it's officially voted in, by UEFA's squad cost control measure type formula, which would align it with European football. And obviously, if clubs realize it's outgoing, they're finding a way to just navigate what might be the last financial year of PSR 2024-2025. And if they can do that, then heading into the second half of the summer, they may be able to spend a little bit differently. But what we've seen is an adaptation in the market. So even if PSR stays, you have these sort of mirror deals or two separate deals instead of swap deals, because obviously the old mentality was, I've got a player for 10 million, you've got a player for 10 million. So it's 0 and 0. We'll do a swap deal, job done. And now you realize that if you call that 10 million separately, the first 10 million you put on your books if you're bringing in the money, and that gets you through the PSR cycle maybe that you're in. And the second 10 million that you spend, you can spread across 5 years in a process called amortization. So actually your incoming and your outcoming for book purposes can be classified differently, and that gives clubs a bit more flexibility. So teams are finding loopholes. I think from Leeds' point of view, if they come back up to the Premier League, they'll be on a slightly different cycle, because when you drop down to the Championship, your allowable losses change, as Nottingham Forest found. But I'm told that Leeds are more comfortable than has been suggested. One, because of a number of outgoings from players, for example, who had relegation release clauses. And two, because of the Red Bull investment, which means at this stage, Leeds don't sort of fear financially they're going to be too restricted in the market if they come up to the Premier League. Obviously, if they don't, that has a ripple effect on the finances. But more importantly, and I'm sure we'll get into this when we talk about January, which is probably what people want to hear about rather than financial numbers. If you are halfway, let's call it, to Premier League promotion, you have to be very careful with what you spend, with who you bring in, and the kind of caliber of player you're looking at may want to wait and see what division they're in next season. And that does make it a relatively difficult window to navigate, because you're in a transitional period where the hope is your Premier League, but is every player prepared to take a gamble and come to the Championship now? Or might some of them say, hang on a minute, let's just wait and see and reassess when we know what division Leeds are in next season?
Yeah, I think it's a smart move from Leeds' perspective as well to keep an eye on that as well. You don't be bringing in players that are going to just take up spots on the bench and not add anything in the run into the season, or bring in a player that if you don't make it over the line at the end of the season is going to cause you problems in a financial situation next season. Obviously, that's the worst case scenario, Ben, and we hope that that doesn't happen, and we're all very confident of going back to the Premier League. But you do have to keep an eye on that, and the fact that it's in these cycles, and we've covered the squad cost model this week on the channel as well, and possibly favours the Leeds United ownership model a little bit if they can get into the Premier League with that model. So, yeah, we'll see what affects everybody. But the drip effect is what I was wanting to talk about, because other teams around Leeds have started making moves. Sunderland, Sheffield United and Burnley all appear to be really, really active in this window, Ben. Leeds have said a quiet window, which for me, I hope means one, maybe two players come in, but somebody comes in. Do you think it's a wise situation or a wise move for Leeds to sit on their hands in this window, given that their rivals are making moves and the gap at the top is so very small?
Yeah, it's fine margins, isn't it? And I suppose from a fan point of view, you think one goal scorer, one depth player in a certain position can make all the difference between going up or being in the playoffs or missing out altogether. But the reality is that you have a kind of inherited problem in some ways from the current Leeds ownership. And although we have to say the transition to the current ownership was over a long enough period that decision making was collaborative, Leeds were kind of in a position where there were some windows historically where finances were a bit tighter. And on top of that, there were a number of players tied into deals that Leeds had their hand forced on. So the departure, for example, of Archie Gray, there was a clause in there. There was nothing they could do. Crescencio Somerville, market value, more than he was sold for to West Ham United. But again, that number was there. And as a result, you have to ultimately respect the clause if the player wants also it triggered and to leave. So that's left Leeds in a position now where they've actually had a lot of turmoil and they've done well, therefore, to stabilise and hopefully have put themselves in a position where they can get back into the Premier League. So there's two considerations, therefore, in January. One is, can you make a savvy addition? And my understanding is there is some money there to be spent. But two is also, how do you protect the squad that you've got? Because what can be equally as unsettling is not just do you or don't you bring in somebody, change the squad dynamic? Are they right? Can they hit the ground running? No preseason with the existing squad. It's difficult for players arriving, especially if they come from abroad. They've never played in England, the Championship. They don't always find a way to impact. So that's one consideration. And then the second thing is, what about this instability within the squad? Because there's so many players right now that can be speaking pre-contract with foreign clubs in the last 6 months of the deal. Junior Firpo, Sam Byram. In addition to that, end of the season, there's a number of players that they may need to tie down. Ilan Melier, who I know is dividing the fan base at the moment. They've got to resolve the Patrick Bamford situation too. So kind of when you add all of that up, you've also got to make sure that you give internal clarity in January. So a player that maybe is considering, and it's quite an underrated point, speaking to a foreign club or moving away, or what's next at the end of the season? Am I wanted? Am I not wanted? Is there another club? Is that a higher standard of football, etc.? And when you have all of that to deal with, you've got to make sure that you steady the ship. And it's not as exciting to fans to be speaking about internal stability at Leeds. But what you don't want is a bunch of players in their head to think, well, I'm going at the end of the season anyway, because I either don't have a new deal or because I've got a better offer from somebody else. And that for also to be a factor in affecting Leeds' form in the second half of the season. So there's two things here. Can they make a savvy addition within the PSR position? And I think they could. And then second of all, can they stabilize and tie down or reassure players that they want to keep so they stay motivated in the second half of the season and their head isn't turned at some point in January by other opportunities? I think Daniel Farke has been quite coy on new signings, which is relatively normal for managers when they know that there's this element of upheaval. But I still think that Leeds will be looking for another goal scorer, potentially a playmaker in a more central area, which is where, for example, the links with Emi Buendia come from. And then simply because of the Junior Firpo situation, a left back high on the priority. And who knows, a centre back that can play right back as well, because obviously, even though they've managed to fill that void, Archie Gray left, he was more right back central midfield. Now I'm kind of hearing a right centre back that can also play right back could be on Leeds' radar as well. So those are the kind of positions I think they're looking at.
I've got some specific names to throw at you in a second, Ben, but on the really good point that you make, Daniel Farke talks an awful lot about he trusts the current squad that he has. He's very mindful of upsetting the dressing room by bringing in someone at this stage, and unless they're going to add value, what's the point in bringing them in? Emi Buendia is a name that's popped up quite an awful lot in recent weeks, and I think he kind of bypasses the needing to get the trust from the manager because Daniel Farke has a pre-existing relationship with him, knows all about him, and knows how to get the best from him. Have you heard anything on the situation around Buendia? Is it a realistic move for Leeds United even at this stage? Obviously, he's not played a lot of football this year, but with Villa bringing in Malin as well as Rodgers having the season of his life this year, Buendia's fallen further on the pecking order. For me, this feels like if Leeds were to do it, it would be like Solomon. They'd wait till the very end of the window, wait till all the dominoes have fallen and then go and pick up their player. But have you heard anything on that, or is it just because it's an easy link to Farke?
No, I think it's more than an easy link to Farke. I think it's a manager-driven move. But the reality is, as of now, of course, things can change during the window, especially if players don't find other options. Buendia doesn't want to drop down. And the perspective of Aston Villa is it's either a permanent sale, which they're open to, and that's not for Leeds right now, or more likely a loan with an option or obligation. And again, Villa's preference is that you either take the loan with the option and pay 100% of the wages, not something that Leeds want to do, or you take the loan with the obligation. They're maybe then a bit more flexible about the wage structure and who pays what over a shorter period of time. But it's difficult because Villa again will be saying to Leeds, it's an obligation, full stop, or it's an obligation if you finish in the playoffs. Whereas Villa, I think, will find that Leeds are retorting, saying, were we to go down that kind of structure, it would have to be an obligation that only kicks in with promotion to the Premier League, because that safeguards Leeds financially as well. So you have this kind of mid-season battle, and unfortunately for a buyer, the seller tends to hold all of the cards right up until the final few days of the window, and then maybe it flips. So right now, the simple answer is that Villa are not giving Leeds any kind of structural option that would be conducive to a club-to-club agreement. That may change in the final few days of the window, but we're not really talking about an engagement now. We're talking, to be clear, about an inquiry that hasn't really led to much. And the reason why they've not escalated it is partly because the seller's got all the cards so early in the window, or even in this middle part. And second of all, because Buendia doesn't want to drop down to the Championship either. So you have this sort of horrible loop of the player kind of open to Leeds, but only in the Premier League. So maybe in the final days of the window, the player then says, okay, I've changed my mind. I'll do 5-6 months in the Championship. And then there's that obligation. So I know if they don't get promotion to the Premier League, then I can get out anyway. And then you have Aston Villa saying, hang on a minute, we're not like a charity. We're not just going to frame a formula around whether Leeds do or don't go up. If you want the player, you've got to pay his wages. You've got to match our structure. So you have this fascinating situation added to the fact, as you rightly say, that now another attacker has come in Malen. And we wait and see whether Leeds rekindle their interest. But at the moment, having made that early inquiry, the feedback Leeds had was that the player was not interested in dropping down to the Championship. So nothing has progressed since.
Okay. One name, Ben, that did pop up last week. I was listening to your podcast or your piece on Give Me Sport, and Ben Davis's name was mentioned. It's come up a few times as well. Farke likes his players to be involved and regularly getting minutes at this point of a season, and obviously Ben Davis has had his issues with hamstring problem in December, and he's not played a huge amount of football. If Leeds were to go down that route, obviously the Junior Firpo future is lingering as well. He's open to pre-contract negotiations right now for any club outside the UK. Do you feel that that's something Leeds maybe look at for this summer? It's if they get promoted, that Ben Davis would be a senior player, would understand the division, and then would make sense bringing him in at that point with a full preseason behind him?
Yeah, I think that is definitely a factor. And, you know, the other thing in all of this from Leeds' point of view is just wage as well. And because the deal for Davis expires during the summer, a bit like Bamford potentially exiting, you're not talking about a greedy player that's going to cling to a previous deal. So Bamford's wages are Premier League, and was he to leave Leeds, he would be prepared to take a cut. And it's the same for Ben Davis as well, who can pre-agree a deal now. And it might just present a situation where, because he's going anyway during the summer, there is a way of, for a nominal fee, trying to make a move now. But as you rightly say, from Leeds' point of view, there's no point in paying for that extra half a season if you're not convinced that the player's either going to be fit or match fit. Then you might prefer just to waive any kind of nominal fee and try and pre-agree something for the summer. Davis, again, a bit like Buendia, not averse to joining Leeds and not averse to dropping down to the Championship temporarily, but he does still feel that if he leaves Spurs during the summer with free agency, there will be Premier League suitors as well. And that's the other thing in all of this, that it's so easy as a fan to make like a neat narrative and say, well, contract's expiring, Tottenham would rather sell than let the player's contract run, and therefore something could be possible. He's the right kind of profile. He's the right kind of position. And all of that adds up to a transfer now. But maybe the player says, I've got the most leverage when I'm a free agent, so I'll wait and see what happens during the summer, and then I'll take my chances and see whether somebody in the Premier League comes for me. And again, by then he'll know, I know I sound like a broken record saying it, whether Leeds are or aren't in the Premier League. So this whole will they, won't they get promoted, definitely puts you in a bit of a limbo position in January. And that is why it's very hard to do business. And I appreciate that when you then see rivals doing business, it maybe looks a bit different. But I actually think that's a compliment to Leeds, because if you sort of look at Sheffield United, who went down really with a whimper, and then you add to that Sunderland, who are more on the rise and maybe have overperformed compared to some people's expectations. These are clubs that essentially can say, let's strengthen at the upper echelons of Championship in terms of quality and profile. Let's get someone maybe from the Championship or an older player that is prepared to drop down. And then it's win-win. Because if we go up, great. We think that they'll be good enough or valuable enough or experienced enough. And if we don't, we're stronger as a Championship side. Whereas I think the sort of backhanded compliment to Leeds in a quiet window, which is probably what Daniel Farke's alluding to, is if all you're doing is adding more top echelon Championship players to a squad that he believes is already good enough to be at the top of the Championship, then what's the point? You need a player that's basically able to transition if everything goes according to plan and be good enough for the Premier League as well. Otherwise, you have a Southampton situation where you go up and your squad's not good enough. So then anyone you buy now might go, might be replaced, or you haven't actually strengthened enough to give yourself a realistic chance of staying up. So you have to be very cautious, and you have to make sure that when you use that budget, whether January or the summer, it's for the kind of profile and player that is good enough for next season, whether that's for another promotion push if the worst case scenario happens, or whether that's to keep you in the Premier League. And I think if Farke's getting players that are as good as he's got, then he's absolutely right to say, let's just have a quiet window and not bring anybody in.
There's no point in having lots of bodies in the dressing room causing problems because they're not getting game time. So why have them there if they're not going to be involved? It's a really good point. Ben, we're running out of time, and I want to make sure I stick to my goal of getting you out of here quickly. So there's been a few names thrown around. Andrew Amabama-Dele, obviously he fills that right-sided centre-back and potentially right-back position. He can play both, has done for Ireland very well for us. Mergen Barisha's name was thrown around but dismissed locally, and then Alvin Sanchez's name has been thrown around as well. There's a lot of people asking, is there any other names, or can you give us any detail on any names that are in the potential mix? And I always caveat everything by saying it's until anything happens, it's all up in the air. So any ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo the sentiments on some of those names that you mentioned that have been downplayed. I think that Alvin Sanchez is a concrete name on Leeds' radar. I don't know whether anything is going to be possible now as opposed to the summer. He's doing really well in the Swiss league. He's a versatile winger. I think he's got something like 6 goals, 3 assists in only 15, 20 games. So a really good record of goal contributions, and somebody on Leeds' radar that won't necessarily break the bank. So that one could be one to watch. And I think what they like about him from inquiries that I've made is not just the, as I said before, goal contributions, but if you look at his mold, he's actually a winger. But if you look at where he plays, he's a centre forward, he's an attacking midfielder, he's a central midfielder, and he's a right midfielder, or you could still say winger. So this isn't even like an Archie Gray right back central midfield. And that was why Spurs liked the idea of signing him. This is somebody that can basically play all over the field. And when I ask Leeds sources, they're not as allured by only the goal contributions. They just like the fact that he has that game management and that versatility to play almost anywhere across the centre of the park in a more advanced position. And it's very rare to have a player that, if you look at how he's been utilised throughout his career and throughout this season, he'll oscillate seamlessly between centre midfield and centre forward. I think, having watched him, those are probably the two main positions that I've noticed. I apologise to those that have got a slightly better knowledge of the Swiss league. But when you have somebody like that, you know they're always going to be able to drop deep and help the team defensively. You know they're going to have playmaker qualities. You know they're likely to have tenacity and movement off the ball, and they can put it in the back of the net as well. So that could be one to watch. I think in terms of other names or links to tell you, the first one that I put out there a while ago, I think exclusively, was a centre-back by the name of Nico Elvedi. And there is concrete substance in this one as well. Centre back, right back. So again, like I said before, you have somebody that can, to a large extent, add to that void left by Archie Gray and also play centre back as well and flip between the two. He's a little bit older and more experienced. He's kind of ready-made for the Premier League. He's probably won 50, 60 caps for his country and will be available in the summer market, I think, more so than January. I wouldn't entirely rule out January, but I think the player, again, will want to wait and see what division Leeds are in because he's got other Premier League options. So that one could be one to watch. And the last name that I would throw into the mix as well, that I'm sure Leeds fans have been speaking a little bit about, is Emmanuel Latte-Lath, who is at Middlesbrough. And unfortunately, it's bad news on this one. Nobody's denying the Leeds' interest. So that's the first thing to say. There is substance to the story, but it's Atlanta United in the MLS that are currently working, as I revealed earlier today, on the player terms. They have an agreement in principle with Middlesbrough. But interestingly, the Leeds' perspective is they haven't bid because they think that there's a Premier League club that are going to come in and maybe try and hijack this deal. So there are other English suitors in the mix. There were some fears at the Atlanta end. Sources tell me that Leeds would bid. So I suppose we have to be alert to a possible surprise. But when I put this to Leeds sources, it was very much downplayed. We haven't made a bid. We think he's either off to the Premier League or to Atlanta United. And seemingly with that industry knowledge, they've backed off that potential deal. But even the fact that they were in the mix for it, it shows you that if they felt the need this window to throw 15, 20 million at a player, they just might. And that answers your first question, that there is that leeway within PSR. Otherwise, they wouldn't even be in the conversation for these kind of players.
That's a perfect note to finish on. Brings us back full circle, Ben, and get you out of here bang on time. Ben, massive thank you for popping in and giving us the time today to have a chat about this. And and best of luck on TalkSport tonight, and good luck for the rest of the transfer. And no doubt it'll be a busy one for you.
Yeah, good luck to Leeds as well. I mean, I'm watching with fascination and excitement. It's a case of a reminder for me, of last season, just to finish with. I'm a Leicester fan. It was where I was born. I've always enjoyed the games between Leicester and Leeds. One of my favourite goals was actually Lilian Nallis scoring an absolute blinder on the volley against Leeds United. So fond memories. But if you look at last season, you kind of had a scenario where there were 3-4 teams up there, all pushing, in particular Southampton, Ipswich and Leicester. And it got to maybe the last 10 games of the season and nobody wanted to win it. Everybody was stuttering. Every time Leicester dropped points, somebody else did. Leeds were obviously there alongside the 3 teams that I mentioned. So you had a 4-horse race for 2 spots. And I felt sorry for Leeds last season because to get 90 points and not go up automatically, that's such cruel luck, because you could replicate that Leeds season or the points tally anyway. And in 90 out of 100 seasons, you're either winning the championship or you're certainly finishing second. So now they've got this slender lead. But again, it reminds me, because you're thinking Burnley, Sheffield United, Sunderland, probably everybody else isn't going to get automatic promotion. And it's so tight. You can basically fall from first to fourth with a bad result if others go against you. So good luck to Leeds. I think they've got a decent run of fixtures now, a couple of home games, I believe, against Sheffield Wednesday and Norwich. Win both of them, and then maybe you get a little bit of a cushion to take away at Burnley, win that game, and then people start to think it's very much in Leeds' control. So yeah, keep up the good work. Always enjoy talking Leeds, and good luck to Leeds for the rest of the season.
Ben, thanks very much, mate. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Talk to you soon. Thanks.
Take care. All the best. Bye.